Everyone in the village mocked her just because she was heavy. No one wanted to marry Sarah. They said she was too heavy even for the wind to carry. But when a mysterious Apache warrior appeared, he ignored all the slender maidens and went straight to her. What this man did silenced everyone, but what happened next nobody was prepared for. Get ready for a story of pain, humiliation, true love, and a twist that will touch your heart until the very end. Since childhood, Sarah already knew she was different. While other girls her age played with dolls made of corn husks and dreamed of their wedding day, Sarah helped her mother grind corn and tend the fire. She had dreams too, of course, but dreams have their time to wake up. Time passed. Childhood friends got married, had children, some left with warriors from other tribes, and Sarah stayed. She stayed to care for her mother, the land, and those who needed help. And the more she stayed, the more they said she was stuck, left behind. It was hard to leave the teepee. Whenever she went to the river or brought something to the tribal council, she felt the judgmental stares. It was as if her presence bothered them. There was one day she tried to bring cornmeal to help with the communal feast, but the other women looked at her sideways, whispering among themselves. Sarah pretended not to notice, but inside, each whisper was like a thorn in her heart. The Apache reservation where they lived was small, and everyone knew everyone. There was no hiding, no escaping the looks and comments. Sarah's mother, Mary, was a wise woman who had been respected in the tribe before age bent her back and clouded her eyes. She watched her daughter's pain in silence, knowing that words sometimes hurt more than they heal. One morning, Sarah woke to the sound of meadowlarks, but didn't feel like getting out of her bedroll. Her body felt heavier than usual, and it wasn't just her body, it was her soul too. The basket of berries she had received the day before was still in the corner of the teepee, and even though it had been a beautiful surprise, she couldn't shake the feeling that it might be another cruel joke. The berries were perfect, wild strawberries hard to find at that time of year. Someone had taken the trouble to pick them, clean them, and arrange them carefully in a woven basket. But who? And why? Sarah had learned not to trust unexpected kindness. Too many times before, someone had pretended friendship only to laugh about it later with their friends. She had noticed other small gifts appearing near her teepee over the past few weeks. A beautiful feather from a red-tailed hawk tied with a leather cord, a small piece of turquoise, polished smooth, a bundle of sweet grass, carefully braided. Each time she looked around to see if anyone was watching, waiting for the laughter to begin, but no one ever appeared. On the third time, she found a gift at her door, this time a clear blue shell tied with a grass cord. She decided she needed to know. She went down to the river where some men were washing their tools and spotted Joseph alone, sharpening a wooden spear. She gathered courage and approached him. "Are you the one leaving these things at my door?" she asked. Joseph looked up slowly, gazed at her as if he had been expecting the question. "I am," he said simply. She crossed her arms, defensive. "Why?" He set down his spear, stood up, and looked directly into her eyes. "Because I see you," he said. "Really see you. And what I see is beautiful." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Joseph stepped closer, not in a threatening way, but with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he meant. "I see a woman who takes care of everyone else before herself. I see someone who brings food to the elders, even when she doesn't have much. I see someone who sits with the sick children when their own mothers are too busy. I see strength, Sarah. I see a heart bigger than this whole reservation." The words of Joseph echoed inside her. "I see you." Those words stuck like seeds in her hair. She couldn't shake them. The day dawned hot, and the smell of roasted corn and burning leaves already filled the air. It was the day of the harvest festival, when the whole tribe gathered to celebrate another year of survival. The young women adorned themselves with feathers, colorful beads, and face paint. Sarah dressed as best she could. She wore her cotton dress, pulled her hair into a simple bun, and put red clay on her cheeks. She didn't look beautiful like the others, at least not in the way the village eyes were accustomed to seeing beauty. The festival was always the same. The young men would dance, showing off their skills, hoping to catch the eye of an eligible woman. The young women would dance too, moving gracefully, their beaded dresses catching the firelight. Sarah usually stayed on the edges, helping serve food or watching the children. But this year, something was different. Joseph appeared at the festival wearing his best clothes, a shirt decorated with porcupine quills and beadwork, leather pants with fringe, and a feather in his long black hair. But instead of dancing with the group or showing off like the other young men, he walked straight to where Sarah was sitting. "Dance with me," he said, extending his hand. Sarah looked around. Everyone was watching now. The music seemed to get quieter. The conversations stopped. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. "I don't dance," she whispered. "Neither do I, usually," Joseph replied with a small smile. "But tonight feels different." Against every instinct that told her to run, Sarah took his hand. They walked to the center of the dancing area, and suddenly the drums seemed louder, the fire brighter. Joseph was not a graceful dancer, and neither was Sarah, but they moved together slowly, carefully, as if they were the only two people in the world. The village watched in shocked silence. Some whispered furiously to each other. Others stared with open mouths. But Sarah, for the first time in her life, didn't care. She was dancing, and someone had asked her to dance, and that someone was looking at her like she was precious. When the dance ended, Joseph didn't immediately let go of her hand. He stood there holding it, looking into her eyes as if making a promise. Then he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "The most beautiful woman at this festival is the one who had the courage to dance with me. The rest of you only repeat what others expect." The silence was absolute. Even the drums seemed ashamed. Sarah wanted to disappear, but she stood there, her heart pounding, and in that moment she knew she would never again let anyone else decide her worth. She walked home without saying another word, lay down beside her mother, who pretended to sleep, but hugged her tightly as soon as she lay down. They didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. Sometimes silence is the most loving response. Since the dance at the festival, she and Joseph had exchanged few words, but actions spoke louder. He would always pass by her house, leaving something useful, a handful of corn, a hard-to-find herb, even a piece of treated leather. She thanked him but couldn't understand what he wanted. She was afraid to believe, afraid to be made a fool of, as had happened before when some had pretended sympathy only to laugh later. One afternoon, while washing baskets in the river, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Rebecca, one of the most popular young women in the tribe, standing with her arms crossed and a hard expression on her face. "What do you think you're doing?" Rebecca asked. "Washing baskets," Sarah replied, not looking up from her work. "You know what I mean with Joseph. He's not for you." Sarah finally looked up, meeting Rebecca's angry gaze. "That's not your decision to make, isn't it? Look at yourself, Sarah. Really look. You think a man like Joseph would want you if he had other options? You think this is real?" The words hit like physical blows. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped the basket she was washing. Part of her wanted to run, to hide, to accept that maybe Rebecca was right. But another part, a part that had been growing stronger since the night of the dance, stood up straighter. "You're afraid," Sarah said quietly. "Afraid? Of what?" "Afraid that maybe I am enough. Afraid that maybe your beauty isn't the only thing that matters. Afraid that if someone like Joseph can see something in me, then maybe you're not as special as you thought." Rebecca's face flushed red. "You're delusional." "Maybe, but I'd rather be delusional than cruel." Rebecca stormed off, but Sarah knew this wouldn't be the end of it. In a small community like theirs, gossip spread faster than wildfire. That evening, Sarah's mother took her hands as they sat by the fire. "Daughter," Mary said, her voice gentle but firm, "if you're going to live running from fear, it's better not to accept this feeling. But if you're going to live with truth, go all the way." Sarah didn't respond. She only knew that for the first time in her life, someone looked at her as if he could see her, really see her, and that was hard to ignore. The next day, Joseph appeared again. This time he brought a small sculpture made of clay and wood. It was her. Sarah recognized the shape of her face, the strong features. He had seen everything in her, even what she didn't want to show herself. "Why do you look at me that way?" she asked, tired of holding back the question. He answered without hesitation, "Because you're whole. You don't pretend to be half of yourself to please anyone." She stood in silence, wanting to believe that, but there was still a remnant of fear inside her, fear that it was all just another trap, another cruel joke that would end like all the others, with her alone picking up the pieces. But Joseph was patient. He didn't push, didn't demand. He simply continued to show up, day after day, with small gifts and quiet words. He would sit with her when she worked, help her carry water from the river, and listen when she talked about her mother's health or her worries about the coming winter. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the sunset, Sarah finally asked the question that had been eating at her. "What do you want from me, Joseph?" He was quiet for a long time, throwing stones into the water. Finally, he said, "I want to know you, really know you. I want to sit with you when you're sad and laugh with you when you're happy. I want to grow old with you and build a life together. I want to love you, Sarah, if you'll let me." "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "I know exactly what I'm asking, and I know it won't be easy. People will talk, they'll try to make us feel ashamed. But I also know that I've never met anyone like you, and I don't want to spend my life wondering what could have been." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not pity or charity but genuine affection. It terrified her and thrilled her at the same time. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he replied. "But I'm more scared of living without you than I am of facing whatever comes." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about Joseph's words. She thought about all the years she had spent believing she wasn't worthy of love, all the times she had made herself small to avoid drawing attention. She thought about the gifts he had left, the way he looked at her, the gentleness in his voice when he spoke her name. Maybe, she thought, maybe it was time to stop living in fear. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She walked to the center of the village, where the morning council was being held. Joseph was there, along with most of the other adults in the tribe. She had never spoken at council before. Women usually only spoke when directly asked, but she stood up anyway. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice stronger than she felt. The council chief, an elderly man named Thomas, looked surprised but nodded for her to continue. "I've lived my whole life listening to what others thought about me," Sarah said, looking around the circle. "I've been told I'm too heavy, too plain, too different. I've been ignored, mocked, and dismissed. But I'm done with that." She turned to look at Joseph, who was watching her with proud eyes. "Joseph has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. Not because I'm desperate, not because I'm settling, but because he sees me for who I really am. And if that makes some of you uncomfortable, that's something you need to work out for yourselves." The reaction was immediate and intense. Some people gasped, others whispered angrily among themselves. Rebecca stood up, her face red with rage. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "She's not suitable for marriage to a warrior like Joseph. She doesn't have the grace, the beauty, the what?" Joseph stood up, his voice calm but firm. "The beauty? Whose definition of beauty are we using? The grace? I've seen Sarah tend to sick children with more grace than I've seen anywhere else. Not suitable. She's the most suitable woman I've ever met." Thomas raised his hand for silence. "This is not a decision for the council to make," he said. "If Joseph and Sarah wish to marry, that is their choice. We will respect their decision." But respect, Sarah soon learned, was easier said than done. The wedding was small, just Sarah, Joseph, their immediate families, and a few close friends. Mary had sewn Sarah a new dress, white cotton with blue beadwork, and Sarah had never felt more beautiful. Joseph wore his finest clothes, and when he looked at her as she walked toward him, she saw nothing but love in his eyes. The ceremony was traditional but brief. They exchanged vows, shared a cup of water from the sacred spring, and Joseph placed a necklace of turquoise around Sarah's neck. When the medicine man pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. But the happiness was short-lived. The gossip started immediately. Some said it was madness, others said it was witchcraft. What no one would admit out loud was the deep discomfort that the sight of their love caused, a discomfort that came from seeing their own prejudices reflected back at them. In the women's circle, the conversations were sharp and cruel. "He must be under a spell," they said. "That woman shouldn't even have the courage to leave her house with so many beautiful girls here, and he had to choose her. He must have lost his sight during the drought." Sarah couldn't take a step without feeling eyes on her back. It was as if every gesture she made was wrong, as if loving someone and being loved in return was somehow an affront to the natural order. One night, while brushing her hair by the fire, Sarah heard a noise, a whisper in the darkness. She stepped out of the teepee slowly and saw something that made her stomach turn. It was a piece of cloth with the initials of her name drawn in charcoal, tied to a bundle of dry leaves. It had been set on fire and thrown near their home. The message was clear. She was not welcome, not wanted, not accepted. Joseph found her crying by the cold ashes the next morning. He didn't ask questions, just held her while she shook with anger and fear. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe I'm not good enough for you." "Don't you dare," he said fiercely. "Don't you dare let them make you believe that. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Sarah. The best thing that's ever happened to this whole tribe, whether they're smart enough to see it or not." But the pressure was taking its toll. Sarah began to lose weight, not from illness, but from stress. She picked at her food, slept poorly, and jumped at every sound. The joy that had lit up her face after the wedding began to fade. Joseph, meanwhile, stopped appearing at tribal gatherings. He stopped participating in hunts, stopped coming to the men's council. Many said he had left for good. Others thought he was preparing some kind of exit strategy. But the truth was simpler. He was protecting his wife the only way he knew how, by removing himself from the situations that seemed to make things worse for her. And that's how they won. The people of the village managed to silence Sarah's love without raising a hand. They had succeeded in making her feel ashamed of the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her. Sarah grew thin, lost the glow in her skin. Her hands became trembling and her body began to cry out for help. Mary, desperate, sought out the traditional healers, but they could do nothing for a broken heart. It was during this dark time that Sarah found a small white stone by her door. Tied to it was a note in Joseph's handwriting. "If you want to give up, leave this stone here. If you want to fight, put it somewhere I can find it. The choice is yours." Sarah sat holding the stone for hours, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The simple stone could say so much. It was the first time someone had offered her a choice, not a judgment, not an ultimatum, but a choice. When night fell, she got up. Her body ached, her legs were weak, but she slowly made her way outside and looked among the stones on the path. She found a small, smooth one about the size of her palm and placed it at the entrance to her teepee. Her heart raced as if she had committed an act of defiance. The next day the stone was gone, and in its place was a small bundle of sage and a note. "Tomorrow, by the old oak tree at sunset." Sarah had a choice to make. She could stay hidden, safe in her misery, or she could take a chance on hope. That evening she walked to the oak tree. Her steps were slow at first, but as she got closer, she began to walk faster. This time she wasn't looking at the ground, she was looking ahead. And although the stairs were still there and the whispers too, something was different, because now, inside her, there was a certainty. Love is not about what others accept. It's about who stays when everyone else turns their backs, and Joseph had stayed. He was waiting for her by the oak tree, and when he saw her coming, his face lit up with a smile that made her remember why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind," he said. "I almost did," she admitted. "But then I realized something. I can't live my life based on what other people think. I can't let their fear become my fear." "And what do you want?" he asked. "I want to be happy. I want to be loved. I want to love you without apologizing for it." Joseph took her hands in his. "Then let's do that. Let's build a life together that's so full of love and joy that they'll have no choice but to see how wrong they were." They held hands as they walked back to the village, and Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Their new life wasn't easy. They built a small house together with their own hands, day by day. It was simple. Just one room with a bed, a table, some shelves, and a fireplace. But it was theirs, and it was filled with love. The silence inside their home was full of presence, full of promise. Lying in bed, Joseph would hold Sarah's hand tightly and say, "I can't promise it will be easy, but I promise I won't let go of your hand." She would smile, lying against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely safe. But their happiness was threatened again when someone set fire to their house. They woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. They barely escaped, grabbing what they could and running out as the roof began to collapse. Outside, the fire was consuming everything they had built. The flames danced high, swallowing the roof with pops and black smoke. Some villagers came out of their houses. startled by the light and smell. But no one approached. No one helped. They just stood there watching. Mary was the only one who ran to them. "Are you okay? My God," she cried. Sarah wept from shock and rage. Joseph stood, still breathing hard, staring at the flames that were destroying everything they had built. But even as they watched their home burn, he squeezed her hand and said, "Fire destroys things, but it also clears the ground for new growth. We'll rebuild." And they did. Their new house was smaller, simpler, but stronger. Built with their own hands, with dried branches, braided grass, and more courage than resources, life gradually returned to its rhythm. Sarah went back to her gardens, Mary taught the village children to weave baskets, and Joseph hunted and chopped wood. But peace was shattered again when Joseph was badly injured in a hunting accident. He came home bleeding, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, barely conscious. Mary ran desperately to help. "My God, what happened?" "I'll explain later. Bring water, get cloths, boil some arnica leaves," Sarah ordered. Mary obeyed, and there at the entrance to their house, Sarah washed her husband's wounds, immobilized his leg with pieces of bamboo, and sewed the cut with thread made from plant fibers. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. That night, Joseph was caught between fever and pain. He was delirious, sweating, moaning. Sarah cooled his forehead with wet cloths, turned his body gently, and whispered calming words in his ear. She slept sitting up, her back against the wall, but always listening in case he called out. Gradually, Joseph's body began to regain strength. In a week, he could sit up. Later, with effort, he began to use a makeshift cane. It was during this period of quiet recovery that an unexpected visitor knocked on their door. It was William, the tribal elder. He came alone, his head bowed and his face tired. Mary recognized him from afar and warned, "There's someone here who never apologized but needs to speak." William entered slowly, his old bones creaking. He sat down heavily and looked at Sarah with eyes full of regret. "I came to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother, your real mother, she wasn't from our tribe. She was Lakota, captured during a raid when she was young. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was strong, like you." Sarah's heart began to race. She had always wondered about her origins, why she looked different, why she felt different. "She died giving birth to you," William continued. "But before she died, she gave me this." He pulled out a bracelet made of small blue beads and silver. She said it was for her daughter, so she would always know where she came from. Sarah took the bracelet with trembling hands. It was beautiful, worn smooth by time and touch. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked. William's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a coward. Because it was easier to let you think you were one of us than to explain the truth. Because I was ashamed of how we treated you, and I didn't want to face the fact that we had failed your mother's memory." She was brave, he continued. She stood up to the men who captured her. She never broke, never stopped fighting. And when she was dying, she made me promise to take care of you. I failed her. I failed you. I let you suffer with the cowardice of those who should have protected you. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "What was her name?" "Morning Star," William said. "She was called Morning Star because she was the first light in the darkness." Sarah looked up at the sky, her eyes wet with tears, and whispered, "Morning Star." She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, and suddenly she felt connected to something larger than herself, something that had been missing her whole life. "I should have told you before," William continued, "but I was weak, and every time I saw you being ignored, I felt the weight of that growing on my shoulders. Today, seeing what you've become, seeing what you've built with your own hands, I needed to tell you, because the shame is mine, not yours." Sarah breathed deeply, fingering the bracelet, trying to imagine the face of a mother she had never known. "She was like me," she said quietly. "She was like you," William confirmed, "strong, brave, and beautiful in ways that matter." The story of how Sarah had carried Joseph home, caring for his wounds and rebuilding their life from scratch, spread throughout the village. Even the harshest critics began to look at her differently. Children started approaching their door, curious to see the strong woman who had stood up to everyone without shouting. Some brought flowers, others just asked, "Are you the one who carried the big man on your back?" She would laugh and say, "I am." One day, One of the oldest women in the village, someone who had never spoken to Sarah before, approached her house. She stood there for a long time, as if gathering courage, then finally spoke. "I wanted to say, I was wrong about you. We all were. You're not what we thought, you're better." Sarah looked at the woman, someone who had watched her grow up, who had been part of the circle of judgment for so many years, and felt something shift inside her chest. "Thank you," she said simply. The woman nodded and walked away, but something had changed. One by one, others began to approach. Not with apologies, most couldn't bring themselves to go that far, but with small acknowledgements, nods of respect, offerings of help. Mary, watching from a distance, said proudly, "That's my girl." Sarah looked up at the sky with tears in her eyes, and she felt her mother's presence too. Both mothers, the one who had raised her and the one who had given her life. Because now, with the bracelet on her wrist and peace in her heart, she knew she had never been alone. She had just been asleep, waiting for the right time to wake up. Time passed differently now. Pain was no longer the center of everything. It was still there, hidden in the corners of memory, but it no longer controlled her life. She had learned to carry it like the bracelet on her wrist, as a reminder of where she had come from, not as a chain holding her back. One day, as Sarah was working in her garden, she felt a familiar flutter in her belly. She placed her hand over her stomach and smiled. A new life was growing inside her, a life created from love and hope and the determination to build something better. When she told Joseph, he cried. They were sitting by the river watching the sunset, and when she whispered the news, he put his head in his hands and wept with joy. "Our child will never know the pain you carried," he said. "Our child will grow up knowing they are loved, knowing they are wanted, knowing they are enough exactly as they are." Sarah nodded, her own eyes wet with tears. They'll grow up knowing that love, when it's real, can change everything. 9 months later, their daughter was born. They named her Hope, and she was perfect, small, brown-skinned with dark hair and eyes that held the calm of someone who had come into the world knowing where she belonged. Mary made a thick porridge to help with her daughter's recovery, and Joseph couldn't stop looking at the child. He sat in the corner of the teepee, his hands on his knees and his fingers intertwined, seeming to pray with his eyes. "She'll grow up without carrying what I carried," Sarah said, cradling the baby. "She'll know from the beginning that she's loved for who she is, not for who others think she should be." Joseph looked around at the walls of their small home, at the life they had built together from nothing, and said, "We broke the cycle. We chose love over fear, and now she gets to grow up in a world where that choice is possible." As Hope grew, the village watched in wonder. Here was a child who laughed freely, who played with confidence, who looked at the world with curious eyes instead of fearful ones. The contrast was stark and impossible to ignore. One evening, as the tribal council was meeting, Thomas, the chief, stood up and said something that no one expected. "I want to talk about Sarah," he said, "about what she's taught us. For too long we've been afraid of difference, afraid of change, afraid of anything that challenged our ideas about how things should be. But look at what our fear almost cost us. Look at what we almost lost." He gestured toward where Sarah and Joseph were sitting with their daughter. "That woman has more courage than any warrior I've known. She faced our cruelty and chose love anyway. She faced our rejection and chose to stay anyway. She faced our ignorance and chose to teach us anyway. And now because of her, we have a chance to be better." The council was silent. Some people were crying quietly. Others just shook their heads. It was hard to admit they had been wrong, but there, in front of that woman and her family, they couldn't pretend anymore. Sarah stood up with her daughter in her arms. She looked at everyone, not with anger, not with superiority, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to value themselves regardless of what others thought. "I forgive you," she said simply. "Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger is too heavy a burden for someone who has already carried enough." The silence that followed was different from the silences of the past. This one was full of respect, full of recognition, full of the possibility of change. Years passed. Hope grew into a confident, happy child who played with all the other children without fear or shame. She learned to read and write, to hunt and fish, to weave and cook. But most importantly, she learned that she was valuable exactly as she was. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor of their teepee, Sarah felt something strange in her chest, a tightness, different from anything she had felt before. She stopped, breathed deeply, looked at her daughter playing in the corner, and walked to the river. She sat on her old rock, the one that held all her memories, and let the tears come. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of completion, of a woman who had traveled further than she ever imagined possible. She pulled out a piece of bark and began to write, using charcoal to form the words, "I am not what they said, not what they laughed at, not what they avoided. I am what remained after all of that, and if anyone wants to know me, they'll have to start from zero, because I started over too." She folded the bark, tied it with a grass cord, and placed it in a clay pot where she kept her most important thoughts. The next day, she taught Hope to take her first steps on the packed earth. The little girl fell twice but laughed, and Sarah laughed with her because she had learned that falling is part of the journey. Sarah's story spread beyond their village, carried by traders and travelers to other tribes. It became a legend of sorts, the story of the woman who refused to be defined by other people's limitations, who chose love over fear, who broke the cycle of cruelty and created something beautiful in its place. And in that small Apache village, things were different now. Children were taught not just to be strong but to be kind. Young people learned that beauty came in many forms, that worth was measured by character, not appearance. The village itself became known as a place where difference was celebrated, where love was honored, where everyone had a chance to belong. Sarah lived to be an old woman, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew her story and carried its lessons forward. She died peacefully in her sleep, with Joseph holding her hand and Hope singing softly by her bedside. At her funeral, the entire village came to pay their respects. People who had once mocked her stood with tears in their eyes, remembering the woman who had taught them what it meant to be truly human. The tribal elder spoke of her courage, her kindness, her unwavering belief in the power of love to transform even the hardest hearts. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Hope, now a grown woman with children of her own. She stood at her mother's grave and said simply, "She taught us that we are not what others say we are. We are what we choose to become." And she chose to become love itself. The wind carried her words across the reservation, and somewhere in that vast sky, Morning Star was smiling, knowing that her daughter had fulfilled the promise she had made before she died, to never let anyone's cruelty define her worth, and to pass that strength on to the next generation. Sarah's legacy lived on in every child who grew up believing they were enough, in every love story that defied convention, in every person who chose courage over comfort. She had changed not just her own life, but the life of an entire community. And that perhaps is the greatest victory of all. Not just overcoming our own limitations, but helping others overcome theirs too. Not just finding love, but creating a world where love is possible for everyone. In the end, Sarah's story became what she had always hoped it would be. Not a story of victim and survivor, but a story of transformation and hope. A story that proved that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to accept the world as it is and insist on creating the world as it should be. The Apache village where Sarah lived became a symbol of what was possible, when communities chose inclusion over exclusion, when they chose to see the beauty in difference rather than the threat. And generations later, her descendants still tell her story, still carry her bracelet, still remember the woman who taught them that love, when it's real, can change everything.